escorted by Senator Harkin and Ambassador Quinn. Please join me in welcoming His Excellency Olafur Ragnar Grimsson, the President of Iceland.
So good morning. What a thrill and privilege it is to have His Excellency President Grimsson here to deliver our keynote address. And I met the President in Columbus, Ohio at the ECO Summit 2 years ago. And he gave such an impassioned presentation that I thought we just have to have him at the World Food Prize. And so I then found out in talking to him that he was very close friends with former Congressman Jim Leach, who is here. Jim, thank you so much for being here. And with Senator Tom Harkin. And Senator Harkin, having put the U.S. government back to work, and thank you for that, Senator. Although as a former federal employee, I have to say that if I had known we were going to get paid anyway, I would have been calling others saying, hold out, don't compromise. But now I'm back in Iowa, I'm much more sensible than that. On that. Senator Harkin is one of the most distinguished members of the United States Senate. He is every handicapped person in America, and I think increasingly around the world, owes a tremendous debt to him for his leadership on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And he has been the chairman of chair of the Agriculture Committee in the Senate. We're now on health care in that regard. He is retiring, not running again. So this will be our state's loss in that, but he's given incredible distinguished service. And since he is such a long-standing friend of President Grimsson, I invited him here to introduce the President. Please welcome Senator Tom Harkin.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Quinn, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for your great leadership in your whole lifetime in service to our country and to our state and to the World Food Prize Foundation. Governor Branstad, Lieutenant Governor Reynolds, my longtime friend, Congressman Jim Leach, and of course, John and Janice Ruan, who are here this morning. Layson, good to see you too, Layson, and all of you who are here. I would like to say single-handedly I did it all myself in opening the government. That's not so. A lot of other people involved, but it is good news. And it's good news that we're paying our bills, and we will maintain our record that never since the Revolutionary War has the United States ever defaulted on any of its debts. It's a proud thing for the United States of America. So, President Grimsson, it's a pleasure and honor to introduce you today to my fellow Iowans and the World Food Prize attendees from around the globe. Olafur Ragnar Grimsson has been many things in his remarkable career: university professor, newspaper editor, member of parliament, finance minister, and since 1996, the president of Iceland, now in his 5th term. I would add one more title: citizen of the world. President Grimsson has had a lifetime dedication to action on the world stage to create a more peaceful, just, and sustainable planet. To that end, for over 2 decades, he was a leader of Parliamentarians for Global Action, including as president of the organization from 1984 to 1990. It was in Parliamentarians for Global Action in 1981 that I first met an up-and-coming young legislator from Iceland, my longtime friend Olafur. And by the way, one of the many things that Iowans and Icelanders have in common is we like to go by first names, no matter how high or low your position. And I might also add, as long as he's sitting here, the person that got me involved in Parliamentarians for Global Action in 1979 was Congressman Jim Leach. And I can honestly say, I think I can speak for Jim too, that since those early 1980s when we first met President Grimsson, I can honestly say that our association with him and our collaboration with him on so many things has been one of the highlights, I think, of our entire public service career. Parliamentarians for Global Action is a nonpartisan international network of legislators from more than 130 countries working together to promote democracy, rule of law, human rights, and peaceful resolutions of disputes. In the 1980s, President Grimsson played a leadership role in persuading the then Soviet Union to move beyond strategic arms limitation agreements, the so-called SALT treaties, to actual strategic arms reduction talks, culminating in the START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty signed by Mikhail Gorbachev and President Bush in 1991. I will never forget being a member of a small delegation from Parliamentarians for Global Action led by President Grimsson in Moscow. We had a lengthy and constructive meeting with President Gorbachev in the Kremlin to encourage him to move forward with reducing nuclear stockpiles and banning all nuclear tests. More recently, President Grimsson has taken a leadership role in focusing world attention on the critical role of the Arctic in relation to a rapidly changing climate. He led the establishment of the Arctic Circle Assembly, which just had its inaugural meeting in Reykjavik this last weekend, which I was supposed to attend with Senator Murkowski, but because of the thing in Washington, I couldn't attend. But I did learn that people from over 40 nations attended with over 700 people at this inaugural assembly in Reykjavik. So that's how Olafur Grimsson operates in the world, working patiently, sometimes behind the scenes, building understandings and principles that lay the foundation for major bilateral and international agreements. Of course, President Grimsson has also been a great leader at home. Under his leadership, Iceland is the world's largest green energy producer per capita in the world. Nearly 85% of the total energy supply in Iceland is derived from domestically produced renewable energy sources, most of it geothermal. I know he opened my thinking